Jujutsu Kaisen has a super big problem, and it isn't like the ones I've talked about in my previous videos. It's something completely different. When Jujutsu Kaisen initially starts, we're introduced to Yuji Itadori as basically the main character of the series. Then as we keep going, we're introduced to Satoru Gojo, then Yuta Okkotsu. What all these three have in common is that they've all at some point in the series been the main focus of the series, with each of them getting their own respective arcs. Yuta with JJK0, Yuji with, well, the first two arcs of the show, and Gojo with Hidden Inventory. But with this, there arises a problem. Something that I'd like to call the main character problem in JJK. Before the video starts, I would just appreciate it if you like and subscribe, and that's it, let's go. So let's start with Yuji Itadori. Yuji Itadori was our initial main character we were introduced to, and like a main character should, the author of the show Gege Akutami imposed a lot of layers onto Yuji's character, making him very interesting. One of those layers being his direct connection to the villain Ryomen Sukuna and his divergent fists, which ultimately made Yuji formidable. Then even better, we had Yuji learn from people like Satoru Gojo, Nobara, and Megami in order to become a better sorcerer. And don't forget Todo, of course. These people basically showing him the ropes and explaining to him what it means to be a Jujutsu sorcerer and how to manipulate his curse energy correctly. With Todo even showing him how to do Black Flash, and Yuji setting the record for Black Flash, which he's still pretty much doing to this day. But the real problem arises with how the series goes on after this, with the introduction of many other characters. For example, Maki Zenin, Naoya Zenin, Kenjaku, Hikari, and the revisitation of Satoru Gojo's character arc. And don't forget the return of Yuta Okkotsu. All of these things collectively led to Yuji being kind of put in the backside of the whole show, which is a little bit annoying because he is the main character, so he should have all the screen time. When it was time for Gojo to finally fight against Sukuna, another thing that was put into question was, what is Yuji's significance anymore to this plot? I mean, one of the layers I brought up earlier that made Yuji so interesting to us was his connection to Sukuna and the fingers. But by the time we get to the Culling Games, Megami is now Sukuna's vessel, kind of making Yuji Itadori's character arc with Sukuna being inside of him completely reconstruct to something new. When we get to the Culling Games, we see Yuji do some impressive things, but in comparison to what he was doing in the previous arcs, it kind of felt like Yuji wasn't getting as much, I guess, support from Gege as he initially was, because Gege was too focused on making characters like Hikari, Kashimo, and others look as cool as he can make them look. So now we go on to Satoru Gojo. Satoru Gojo was someone who was always pretty much the main focus of the show. We can even go back to episode 1 when Yuji wakes up in Jujutsu High and Gojo's right in front of him. From this point on, we learn a lot about Gojo, his clan, his abilities, and basically what makes Satoru Gojo him. Then we move on to the show and Satoru Gojo gets sealed, kind of putting the focus away from him so that they can go back to other characters. I feel like JJK has kind of lost its main character, and because of that, it just kind of feels like they're flip-flopping between multiple different characters. I mean, to be fair, I've always thought that Yuta was pretty much the main character or definitive main character, if you can even like word the sentence like that, because of his role now and what he meant as a student to Jujutsu High. Yuta's always meant to be the predecessor of Satoru Gojo, and this has been stated multiple times in the manga. I mean, to be fair, Yuta Okkotsu is someone who has a lot of abilities that would make him get to that level. Additionally, when Yuta is brought back, we get to see Yuta versus Yuji, and because of this, I mean, once Yuta returns, we kind of get a hog for spotlight between the two. Yuta even shines against Ryu and other characters like Oro in the Culling Games, and basically has, I'm pretty sure, top 3 points in the Culling Game as a whole. Because of how long it's been since we'd seen Yuta Okkotsu in the manga, I feel like Gege was trying to just show off Yuta's powers and once again show us how badass Yuta is. But because of this, we get Yuji fighting against some of the trashiest characters I've ever seen, and then our next character, which I'm about to get into, Megami, fighting against, well, Reggie. Now let's talk about the lack of quality in these other fights in the Culling Games. Reggie vs Megami is one of the worst fights I've seen in Jujutsu Kaisen. My friend has a video on this, please watch it. It lacks a lot of the progressive elements that make fights in Jujutsu Kaisen so interesting. It doesn't really provide a lot of information for us, but instead it just kind of feels like another excuse to have Megami on screen. Megami's lack of progression is something I bet you've heard a million Jujutsu Kaisen YouTubers talk about, but you haven't heard me talk about it, so buckle up and listen. Megumi has not progressed at all, and with Megumi pretty much being dead, I don't see a point in him even being classified as someone who has great potential. Instead, he's wasted potential. With Sukuna taking him over as the vessel, pretty much, he is done. He's out of here. But it's not just Megumi who has this problem. We see this with other main characters like Yuji. Yes, Yuji has progressed, but it's not in the same way that we see a main character like Naruto or Asta progress. For example, there was a lot of stagnation with Yuji from the Culling games all the way up to now, and the only thing that was able to stop that stagnation was just him randomly getting power-ups because he's fighting basically the strongest person in the series. When I think of a main character's arc, they're supposed to go through substantial training. This has always been a problem with Yuji. For example, in Shibuya, it seems like we can just use our brains to deduce he's gotten stronger, but the series does a bad job of making this clear to us. Yes, he's gotten stronger in Shibuya in comparison to Goodwill, but you have to go over those said reasons. And listen, I'm not claiming to be a good author at all or know what I'm talking about in comparison to Gege. I mean, JJK is a good series, but these holes are worth mentioning. Making Yuji's power-ups and his whole existence feel very unearned. I mean, there's nothing with being a natural learner, but when you're literally picking up things super fast the way Yuji does, it kind of just makes it super uninteresting for us. Then we also have statements that claim that he's on par with Sukuna because of their fight, which is pretty ridiculous to me as someone who's read most of Jujutsu Kaisen. To make it even worse, I feel like the way Gojo was done was completely wrong. When Gojo was fighting against Sukuna, it was a battle of the strongest of all time versus the strongest of today. A very even fight which displayed all types of different powers that we never seen before in JJK, even giving us insight on domains and giving us the information that we needed to really understand what it means to be at the top of Jujutsu sorcery. With this, we got to see both take the upper hand. Sukuna took the upper hand early in the fight and Gojo took the upper hand towards the middle of the fight, but the way the fight ended was kind of ridiculous. Gege had made it seem like Gojo won, but instead Gojo actually died and got sliced by Sukuna. This is what I call character assassination. Let me get more in depth. When we see Gojo in the afterlife after Sukuna has finally sliced him to death, we see him talk about the fight and reminisce on it. Instead of him actually just saying that, well, he lost and it was a fair fight, he goes ahead and says that Sukuna was just the better man and stronger, which is not true if you watch the fight because Gojo took the upper hand way more times than Sukuna did. Sukuna only technically won. With Gojo being very out of character in this moment, I mean, the way Gojo's been depicted from us from the beginning of JJK to now, it seems like he's a very confident character that wouldn't really lie like this. So we see that the main character problem goes just beyond screen time, but now it's to the point where Gege's actually assassinating narrative for the sake of just having cool fights. Even with Yuta, I feel like Gege hasn't done a good job with Yuta. I mean, the last chapter it grew on me, but it didn't really display what we had been waiting for. But Gege feels like he can just push his character dynamics and narratives to the side for the sake of cool fights, which I guess is interesting for the casual viewer, but for fans like me and core fans of the series, it feels like that Gege is kind of just causing the main character problem and doesn't care anymore.